I think, oops, continue. I think most of you know that Megan has been a longtime advocate for children and youth in the community. She was initially providing direct service to families of newborns, and then she was the head of CASA for 15 years, CASA of Lane County for 15 years. And now since 2015, she's been the coordinator for the 15th Night Community Group. And this past year, last fall, 15th Night convened a 35-member youth-informed task force to develop a comprehensive shelter housing plan for youth ages 11 to 17. Yes, we have unaccompanied youth as young as 11 years old on the streets. She's going to tell us more about what the task force learned and what the recommendations are for moving forward from this point. Thanks, Megan.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to make a couple disclosures. One is something's wrong with my plumbing, so I have a plumber here. And my water heater happens to be in the same room that I'm sitting in. So anyway, there may be some strange sounds, hopefully not, but that's what that's about. Also, Susie knows this because she's been on a lot of Zoom meetings with me, is like, Zoom makes me so anxious. I just, yeah, I don't like it. But so I'm going to do my very best to hopefully share my screen if someone can make me the host. And if I'm unable to share my screen, even though I've practiced 5 times already today, I know all the information and I can share it with you without sharing my screen. I want to thank you first for all the things that you do and have done in our community for so many families and organizations and youth and kids. The list is really long. The way that you stepped up during COVID is just astounding. All the people that you fed, all the supplies you got out, the help with the vaccinations, it's like, it never ends. You're always just willing to step in and help however our community needs it. And so I want to, on behalf of our community and organizations, I want to say thank you, because not everybody can or does that. And you're really leading the way for other parts of our community to do that. I also want to thank you for stepping into this space of homelessness in regards to youth. And Randy, when you talked about Bruce Shaw, I almost can't say the name because it makes me want to cry. He was a very special guy to a lot of people, including me. And I think that is just so awesome that you are continuing his legacy by awarding youth with nothing an opportunity for something. So thank you.
Megan, you are a co-host now, so you can share your screen.
So let me see if I can actually do this.
Yay!
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So Susie mentioned, so just really quick, 15th Night, I think probably most of you know what 15th Night is, but it is a youth-informed community movement to try and address youth homelessness in our community. So 15th Night has a very active youth action council that has been with part of the movement since day one. And we have youth who did drop out of school and experienced life on the streets. We have students who are currently homeless, but still attending school. And then we have kids who have never been homeless, but just care about the issue. And so they have been and are a huge part of the 15th night effort, and they really help us try and understand what the barriers are and what the solutions might be. And then there's a lot of people, including Southtown Rotary, that are a big part of addressing those barriers and finding those solutions. So one of the things that we do or have done over the last couple of years is convene big groups of people to talk about barriers related to some resource that students who are homeless may be trying to access. Prior to COVID, we had just completed a task force on youth employment, trying to understand what were the barriers for youth who were trying to get a job, and also what were the barriers to them keeping that job and being successful in it. And so that ended with something that we call the youth employment pathway. And the agencies that are leading that work for the youth employment pathway are Connected Lane County, Dev Northwest, and Goodwill Industries. So once the plan was in place, those are the agencies that partnered together and are implementing the youth employment pathway. Shelter and housing was on the docket for this year. And so despite COVID, we decided to move forward with that. As Susie mentioned, we convened a 35-member task force to look at what were the barriers, what resources already existed in our community, and then try and come up with a plan. And Susie was actually a part of that 35-member task force. And so all of the agencies that you would expect to be at a table like this were at the table. And then there were several organizations that you would not expect to be at the table that were there with us trying to figure this out. And most importantly, youth were at the table with us. So most importantly, we were listening to not only our own Youth Action Council, but other youth who were accessing services at our local community agencies. So this is what we found. We talked a lot at the beginning about how do kids even end up on the street? Like, what are the things that happen that cause them to actually be on the street or looking for some type of emergency shelter? And so this little pathway here are the things that we came up with as the task force. You know, family discord is a big one. Something's happening within the family and there gets to be a critical moment in time, and either the youth chooses to leave or is asked to leave. So family discord is part of the pathway. Their family may be experiencing chronic homelessness. And what we find sometimes is that as the youth get older, that sometimes the youth themselves feel like they can better navigate this situation on their own, and that they wouldn't be as big a burden to their family if they weren't a part of the mix. So that is happening. Financial instability leads to youth homelessness. Youth who are exiting foster care and or running away from foster care. So as much as the systems and the one I used to work in with CASA tries to ensure that youth who are exiting foster care have the supports that they need, there are youth who exit with nothing. They have no direction or support or know what they're supposed to be doing. So we see those students or youth on the street as well. Poverty, values and beliefs not aligned with their family. So, and this kind of also correlates with sexual orientation or religious beliefs. We do see a lot of kids who identify as LGBTQ, and parents will say, not in my house. And you literally have a kid on the street because of that. And I'm not here to point fingers at the parents at all. I think that, you know, there's a lot of work that we can do to help support families to understand why kids are making those choices. And also I think most people don't understand what happens when a kid is on the street for the very first time, which is all about why the 15th night has its name, is that Looking Glass Community Services observed that a youth who is brand new to the street, that we as a community have a narrow window of time to intervene before they're likely to become chronically homeless. And that is 2 weeks or 14 nights. And our then city manager, John Reese, said, we got to figure out how to ensure that a youth never has to choose to spend a 15th night on the street. So that's how the 15th night name came to be. But if you ask kids, it's not 15 nights. It's a couple. It could be 24 hours, 48 hours, because bad things happen quickly, especially with the kids that are new on the street. And we definitely saw that during COVID. Mental health issues, that could be for a parent or the youth themselves. Substance abuse, substance abuse is here. Again, it could be the parent or the youth. Abuse and neglect. So there's lots of reasons why kids end up on the street. And honestly, when I very first started this work, I thought it was all about this. Kids just didn't want to follow the rules in their house. And that's why they ended up on the street. That's what I believed. And I learned quickly that I was wrong, that that is actually very few youth whose story is, I just didn't want to follow the rules of my parents' house. So now we know, so the task force looked at the pathways, and then we started looking at, well, what were the barriers to the access to our community resources and services? And ironically, we found that they're similar between the parent and the youth. And so a parent who may be struggling up here with family discord or, substance abuse with their child having substance abuse or sexual orientation, parents are ashamed to reach out for help. That shame is probably the biggest thing that we see on the parent side. So it's shame that a lot of times parents will think that they're the only parent that's going through this. Like, my child is going through this and I'm the only one. And so I'm ashamed. I don't want anyone to know. And I'm afraid of what's going to happen. So fear and isolation. They don't know where to go to get help. They're willing to ask for it, but they don't know where to go. Or they have reached out and they haven't gotten what they needed. And then we see the same thing on the youth side, this shame and fear. We also learned that, if a peer has had a bad experience at an agency or with a program, they're going to tell others, and then others won't even try it. So there's, a lot of work that we need to do around that. Obviously, peer influence is a big influence on accessing resources and services. So now we know those things. The next thing we did is, I'm going to scroll down here and hope it works. We did a resource mapping of what were existing community resources that already existed for 11 to 17-year-olds here in our community as it related to shelter and housing. So the group came up with identifying the different types of shelter and housing, and then looked and see who is doing that, who already has that. So, we have Looking Glass Community Services is our only shelter for 11 to 17-year-olds. They have 12 beds prior to COVID. They had 12 beds. That's the only place that an 11 and 17-year-old can go. And what we also know from the task force, that it's estimated that there's about 791 kids in the Eugene, Springfield, and outlying areas that are experiencing some type of homelessness. And so 12 beds doesn't cut it.
What was the number that you just said?
791.
Wow.
Megan, and those are unaccompanied, yes?
Well, no, yes and no. The unaccompanied number comes from the school districts have to identify and track students who are identified as unaccompanied. That means they're navigating school, life, and homelessness without their parent or guardian. And prior to COVID, between Bethel, 4J, and Springfield, there were about 560 unaccompanied youth. So yes, Susie, the biggest portion is unaccompanied students.
And those, of course, since they're students, that doesn't account for the kids who have dropped out of school, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That unaccompanied number are kids who are actively in school.
Yeah.
During a school year. So one of the things that we wanted to do was figure out what do we already have in our community, and then figure out where the gaps were and how we would address those gaps. We broke things down into 3 categories. The first, now this was surprising for us, for me anyway. We were talking about shelter and housing, and when we looked at the pathway and the barriers, we realized that there needs to be work done on prevention or shelter diversion. So this whole category of prevention and shelter diversion came up. And so we were looking at, how do we support a youth in crisis who is still housed? They're still housed, something's happening, that family discord, something's happening. How do we help those students and their families access resources by removing as many barriers as possible? And we know that youth in crisis are going to talk to a peer. They could reach out to a community member, a community provider to ask for help. They may be asking school staff for help. And then we're saying, well, so if a peer found out that this student needed help, what would the peer do? Well, the peer might go to a school staff person, or 15th night in our local high schools. Most of our local high schools have what we call a rapid access network. So we have gone in and done resource mapping inside of a high school to identify what resources and services are already available inside or near their school building. And then we set up this alert system that any staff member, whether you're the librarian, the custodian, the cook, and the math teacher, can use this alert system to help a student access the resources and services in their building, like in real time right now. So, and the RAN network is made up of, we have school RANs, and then we have community RANs. So a community RAN, that's what we started with at the very beginning of 15th Night, is creating a rapid access network that our McKinney-Ventos and community service providers can use to help connect unaccompanied students to community resources and services. But now that you can also do that inside of a school. So we did a lot of work on shelter, diversion, and prevention. This is just a graphic, but there's a whole, this is the report that I can send you a link to, but there's a whole summary of what that graphic actually means. We also looked at, so shelter diversion didn't work. And now we have an emergency. We have a kid in crisis. what's going to happen. So obviously we have Station 7. That is a place that kids could go. Many of you know that Youth Era is working on creating a low barrier, what they're calling a youth hostel at 44 West 7th in Eugene that would be open 24/7.
And I'll just throw in here that that's what one of our district grant applications is for, is to supply that new center with equipment that they will need.
What was the
Yes, and
address of
thank
that?
you. There's, yeah, it's a big remodel that has to happen inside of that space in order to provide this resource.
What was that address again, please? Sorry.
It's 44 West 7th Avenue in Eugene. It's right across from the Holt Center and right next door to Connected Lane County's new Spark Lab that's going to be opening later this month, which is super exciting. So there's a great partnership between those two agencies. In our recommendations, and I'll get back to this and really hammer on this one, but host homes. A Family for Every Child brought the host home program, which is a national program to help house unaccompanied students who need housing in basically a volunteer or community family who's willing to host this student. And it could be on an emergency basis, like just for a couple nights, or it could be for a longer term basis. They had to jump through a lot of hoops from the state in order to bring this program to our community. And in our recommendations, we talk a lot about this resource here, the host home program. And then the final category, so maybe here it is. The final category is transitional housing. Shelter diversion didn't work. Emergency and temporary respite housing didn't work in that you're not able to go back home. You can't keep staying in emergency shelter. So then you do have handfuls of students who are going to need transitional housing. And so here's the St. Vinny's Girls House. You were a big part of getting that open. That's part of the transitional housing resource in our community, thankfully. This should not say Station 7. Looking Glass also has some transitional housing programs, and host homes would be considered traditional housing program. So the three categories: prevention or shelter diversion, respite/emergency housing, and then transitional. So we really focused on what was available already in those three categories, and then what do we need, what's missing in order to help serve those 790 kids. We believe that the biggest bang for our buck is the host home program. The thing that's because the host home program, the only cost to the host home program is the staff that need to recruit, screen, train, and then support the families and then the youth themselves that are part of the host home program. And it's cheap compared to providing emergency shelter or transitional housing. It can also be really flexible to meet a lot of needs. So we could have host homes that were just a respite emergency. We also talked about having what we call family kinship, meaning the host home is not just a community member who's volunteered to open their home, but it's a person who said, I will open my home for this specific child. So you see that a lot in foster care. When a kid comes in, you know, a neighbor, an aunt, somebody says, I'll provide foster care for that particular child. And then they're certified to do it for that particular child. So host home program could also do that. It could support a home that's willing to open up for a specific child. We also want to make sure that, because we know there's a lot of kids who are identifying as LGBTQ who are homeless, or at risk of being homeless on the street, that there are families that are willing to support those students, and also students who may be pregnant or parenting as teens, and then our Latinx population as well. So host homes can meet a lot of needs for low cost, and really provide the best like individual support for that specific youth that's in that home. So we're strongly advocating for the host home program. Peer support services was another thing that came up, especially when we were talking about prevention and shelter diversion. Peer support services looks like a lot of different things. There are family peer support specialists, and there's also youth peer support specialists. And those are people that have lived experience navigating different kinds of systems or challenges, either as a parent or as a youth themselves. And these people that are become peer support specialists actually go through a certification process to be certified as family support or peer support specialists for youth. And we have several agencies in town that already have peer support specialists working in their programs. So Looking Glass, Youth Era, Centro, and Direction Services all have paid peer support services in their programming. We'd like to see that expanded. And then finally, this youth support center, this actually came from work prior to the task force. It had to do with youth who were involved with law enforcement somehow. So there was some kind of interaction with law enforcement. Most youth who have interaction with law enforcement are not committing types of crimes that would send them to Department of Youth Services or have them housed at Department of Youth Services. So what happens is, you know, you have a kid that, like, let's say shoplifts, and the community believes that the officer is going to transport that youth to Department of Youth Services, and they are going to be detained there, you know, for some period of time. Well, that's not what happens. They do not go to Department of Youth Services. That is not a detainable offense. So we found a program that in the Portland area is called a navigation center, which can be confusing because now we're calling navigation centers resources for people that are experiencing homelessness. But this is a place where initially a officer could bring a youth who either had committed a non-detainable offense or just needed help, that the officer was you know, talking with, and found out that this youth just needed help. So this youth support center would be open 24/7. It would have peer support and family support specialists available 24/7. And it was slated to open prior to COVID at the Whitebird house on 12th. And so Whitebird was, we want to do this. We want to be supporting youth and families in this way. And really it was about, you know, de-escalating the situation, doing crisis mitigation, trying to figure out, is there a way that the youth could go back home safely, and then help connect to our existing community resources and services. So what the Youth Housing Task Force said was that we wanted that to expand beyond youth who were interfacing with law enforcement to just any youth who needs help for any reason. You could just walk in, call 24/7 into this center. So anyway, that's part of our recommendations as well. So we have I can send out the link to all of our recommendations and why we're making them and the data behind that. What we said as a task force was, we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers, but we have enough to get going. And what we're asking people to do with this information is, if you are in a position of, if you are a funder, that you prioritize and reinvest in our existing community resources. So we have to ensure that we are continuing to have the doors open at our existing community resources, and then allocate new resources to those things like a youth support center, the youth hostel. It will be a new resource. And then advocate just within your circles. Like, people need to know about this information. They need to know that, what's going on with youth homelessness, and that we have some answers in regards to shelter and housing. And we just have to figure out a way to make it happen.
Megan, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to adjourn
I'm
the
done.
meeting.
I'm actually done.
And if you want to stay and ask questions of Megan, I'm hoping she would be willing to stay and answer